I am the good shepherd. Well, what does Jesus mean by that? And I think in order to understand what Jesus means by the good shepherd, we have to learn a little about sheep. I'm sure most of us probably haven't seen a flock of sheep, or if you have, you just saw it, you didn't follow it. I certainly haven't. And a little bit about what the shepherd does, and then look at what shepherds are in the religious and political realm at the time of Jesus. And it's also pretty much at the time of us. Simply, sheep need to be led to food and water. They cannot really survive by themselves in the wild, and so they need someone to show them how to get around. And they're pretty defenseless. They don't have any means of fighting back. They're very slow, and so they need somebody to defend them as well. And as we've heard in some of the gospel stories, they also have a tendency of wandering off. And so therefore they need somebody to bring them back into the sheep flock, into the flock, in order to watch over them. And so this is the job of the shepherd. And the shepherd knew his sheep. He knew which ones were his, and apparently sometimes flocks would intermingle, but when it was time to separate, the sheep knew who to follow to take them back to their pastures. And the shepherd would guide them to that pasture so they would know that he knew which place had the best grass and had water and could take care of them. And then he gathered back those that would wander off, and how many of our kids wander off and we have to bring them back as well. And the shepherd would risk his life because he loved these sheep. These was his. And as the gospel said, the hired hand would run away if a wolf came after the sheep. But the shepherd belongs to them. And the shepherd in ancient history is a model of a religious and political leadership of the times. And we can remember King David was a classic example of that model of a good shepherd. And it's interesting because he started off as a shepherd. As we recall, when he was called by Samuel to be anointed, he was out tending the flocks. He was taking care of them. And so he knew the sheep. He also knew the people, the shepherds, and the people around him. And he could protect them against predators. As we found out in the story of Goliath, he was pretty good with a slingshot. And so apparently if the wolves came, he would hit them with a slingshot and they would run away and go away. As the king, he guarded and protected his people. And he knew his people. He knew their needs. He knew what they did. And he had to protect them from foreign invasion. And apparently, fairly regularly, every summer, he would gather his army. They would go out to some place and fight off some group that was trying to encroach on their territory or attack their farmers. And so therefore he protected the farmers, and therefore he protected the food source as well, so that the people had plenty to eat. He knew his people, and he was actually one of them. And throughout David's reign, he depended upon God. He knew God was with him in all he did. And particularly in that story of Goliath, he knew God would protect him. Now at the time, the religious leaders at the time were not really good shepherds. In fact, they would probably be the worst shepherds in the world. They were modeled after the Roman way of leadership. And that was that about 5% of the people in the Roman Empire managed virtually everything. And the 90% to the 95% of the people lived on a day-to-day basis. And there was a lot of corruption. People would raise the taxes on farmers. Farmers couldn't pay the taxes. They lost their land. And the wealthy would buy up the land, and the farmers would become day laborers and have to live on a day-to-day basis. Life was not good for the 95%. It was great for the 5%, but not for the 95%. The leaders were only concerned about what kept the elite happy, and probably the military as well. And people barely had enough to eat. And the prophet Ezekiel, even 300 or 400 years before that, was it 500 years before that, even saw this process going on, and he wrote in his chapter 34, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, to the shepherds, thus says the Lord God, woe to the shepherds of Israel who have been pasturing themselves. Should not shepherds pasture the flock?" And Ezekiel noticed that the elite were pasturing on the people. They weren't providing for them. They weren't taking care of them. And so when we look at Jesus' ministry, and remember he started off in the Galilee, And this is a highly agricultural area. But a lot of these people had lost their land because of, as I said, taxes or rent, or they couldn't afford things, and they sold their land. So either they became tenant farmers or day laborers. And Jesus knew their life. He preached to them. He met with them. He'd eat with the thieves and the prostitutes, but he also probably ate with the farmers and the people who have lost their jobs. As Pope Francis said, he smelled like his sheep. And he advocated for their needs, and his preaching is always about taking care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, those people that are suffering on a day-to-day basis. And he condemned the practices of the political and religious leaders. You know, they were worried about their property, their things. They weren't worried about the people and those outside their small circle of friends. And Jesus was willing to die for them, and several times before his final death, he came close to it. One story is he was told by the Pharisees that Herod was trying to get him and kill him, and so he left. And he truly loved these people. He cared for them. He wanted them. And he was guided by the love of God. Clearly, he and God were, what do they say, joined at the hip, you might say. And this is why he was the good shepherd. He cared for the people. He loved them. He followed God's commands, and he advocated for them as well. Now, we see this shepherds today, many different places. I suppose political leaders are also shepherds, and they need to follow what Jesus was saying. Care for the people, make sure we have everything we need, and make sure we're safe. But I'd like to look at something a little different, because I think tomorrow is Earth Day. And our religious leader, Pope Francis, is calling for greater care of our common home. And so Jesus would be here as well, as we got to take care of the environment in order to take care of us, because we depend upon the environment. The environment depends upon, our crops depend upon the environment. And when you have floods that wipe out crops, or you have pollution and things like that, and Pope Francis points out that most pollution seems to hit the poor people more than the wealthy as well. And so there are many other shepherds, and we can only, even in our recent history, shepherds who advocated for the people, Oscar Romero in El Salvador. Many nuns and priests who were advocating for the poor lost their lives in South America because they loved the people, they smelled like their people, and they advocated for them. And so we're called also in our lives to be shepherds to those around us. Clearly, parents are shepherds to their families, but shepherds to people in our community, but also taking a caring attitude about the environment, but about the people, about all that's going on in our world. And I would finally close with a quote from Psalm 100, which is a beautiful song that I won't sing for you. We are his people, the flock of the Lord. And remember that, we are his people, we are the flock of the Lord.